For this painting, I am working on a Fredrix mixed media canvas board. These are super smooth, so it makes it really easy to get all of the little details, and the blending comes out smoothly. I'm not fighting the roughness of the canvas on this. What I've done, I started with white. I am using Liquitex Basics, and I started adding purple dioxazine as I went up. More and more purple, and eventually some blue up towards the top. And I'm keeping my brush strokes mostly horizontal because anything that does show, I want to make sure it's a horizontal brush stroke. I'll occasionally, like there, kind of scribble back and forth just to even out some of the initial paint, but then I go back over it horizontally to make sure, again, any brush strokes are going that direction, so it would just look like clouds if I don't blend perfectly smooth. We will have quite a few real-time chunks mixed in with this, so we're just kind of speeding through this section here. I am mixing water with my paint so that it flows smoothly. Here I'm adding the phthalo blue right over the purple and pulling that down into the purple. I want to make sure that this is as smooth as I can get it before I start with the mop brush. Now I have my mop brush and I'm just very lightly going over everything in every which direction to get rid of any brush strokes. Remember, with the mop brush, if it gets wet, if it's picking up paint, it will create strokes instead of getting rid of them. That brush has to be completely dry in order to work. And that means dry from water or paint, because it does pick up that paint. If it starts picking up paint, grab a fresh mop brush. I always like to have a couple next to me so that I can quickly go back and forth between the two, because if one of them starts to get too wet and you get to a point where you have to rinse off the tips of it, and just rinse the tips, you shouldn't have to rinse the whole brush because it takes way too long to dry. But if you have to stop while you're trying to use your mop brush to blend and rinse that, then get it all the way dry, your paint's going to be dry. You're not going to have time to use the mop brush at that point. So this is where having multiples of those is definitely a good idea when you're working with acrylics. Now, for those of you who are oil painting, you can use most of the techniques that I'm doing here. The only difference is I would first draw out my mountain scene and where the water and rocks are going to go and just paint around them so that I'm not having to let all of this paint dry in between. With acrylics, I'll do my entire background and then paint over it. Softening that out with the mop brush. And I don't need it to be completely soft because I'm going to be airbrushing this, what I'm doing now, and then stars over it. And I do have this in the supply list of my website. I will have a link below in the video description, but I do have that template listed. It is an FX texture stencil, I believe. It's semi-flimsy. It's not that thick plastic that you often see with a lot of the other stencils, but it works so well for creating the spacings, and I've had this one for years, so it does last a long time if you're careful with it. I'm creating that Milky Way look back here, and then airbrushing some of the turquoise over it. And I'm airbrushing some of that teal turquoisey color into the background as well. Now I am just flicking stars with white paint. I've mixed a bit of water in with the white paint and then used a stiff brush and a palette knife, and I pull the palette knife towards myself, which causes the paint to flick off the brush and onto the canvas. Don't do the reverse though, or you will flick yourself in the face with your stars. I might be speaking from experience. So I'm blocking in where my water is going to go. I've mixed this teal color by mixing together phthalo blue, phthalo green, and white. I'm I'm starting to block in the shapes in the water, and I've got to make sure that I'm going completely horizontal. I keep switching brushes. I'm just trying a few different brushes out here to see which I like better for the results that I'm trying to get. I'm making these little sketchy horizontal lines. Don't go too sketchy because you don't want it to just look like fluffy, furry water, but they're little horizontal brush strokes. This is with a darker teal, so much less white, but it's the same colors. And this will move into real time pretty soon, so you'll be able to see when I'm working on most of the water that you will be able to see the brush strokes better. But I cannot stress enough the importance of keeping your water horizontal. Even if you've got a water line like the beach, the edge, the sand is kind of at an angle, you still want the water to be completely horizontal. Don't follow the angle of the land. It will not look right. So getting some of these highlights now. I've mixed white in with my mixture. I'm focusing the majority of the highlights here. It kind of lines up with that Milky Way is in the background. Now, one thing I recommend, don't start, when you do the highlights like this on your water, don't start with your brightest color. Because if I started with just white for the highlight, I wouldn't be able to get the white sparkles on top. Really watch where you use white, that you're not just leaving straight white all over your piece. There are very few instances you want straight white. So move this into real time so you can see how I'm moving my brush back and forth. This is just a small round brush. I actually think that Taklon bristled flat brushes work better than the round brush that I'm using here. I'm not in love with this brush, but I wanted to give it a try. Using a darker mixture towards the back where the mountains will be. And that is mostly going to be the phthalo blue and phthalo green, with very, very little or no white. Now, one of the things that I ended up doing, and I don't think I had the video camera on for this, I'm pretty sure I didn't, but later on I went back through with some of this teal color and brushed in around the edges of the Milky Way, so it wasn't just flat white. It looks very flat right now in the sky, and by pulling that additional color into that, you'll see it later on, not necessarily the painting portion, but that it was painted in. I just used a filbert brush, a small one, and went through and just blocked in some of that color around the Milky Way, and it actually made it look a lot better. But for this painting, I was the best at not turning on my camera when it should have been on. For the live stream that I did while painting this, yeah, I pretty much did not have my camera on that whole time. I was so mad at myself. So where I'm painting the grass on the rocks, you're going to just see the crappy live stream video from that, which is really not very good. I apologize, but I like this design so much that I want to try doing the same thing over the Liquitex pouring medium. So there is a good chance that I'll be doing that exact same technique with those rocks again very, very soon. So again, keeping everything in horizontal lines. And this is semi-time consuming, but it really looks nice so that the water feels like it has a little bit of movement. And you don't have to do it this way. You can leave the water so that it looks like that smooth glass, and you wouldn't have all of these brush strokes over them. And I'm not really drying the paint in between layers. It's drying on its own. If you're working in oils and you get to where you can't have brush strokes really showing, they're just blending together, then you know it's time to let it dry and then come back later and add to it if you're trying to build this texture. But for acrylics, it dries fast enough that I'm not having to use the hairdryer for this portion at all. And just keep layering and layering. Again, I'm not using any straight white yet. Now that I have the majority of that on there, I can come back through with a little bit of straight white, but I'm not going to go crazy with this. Had I used the white to begin with, you wouldn't be able to see any of the very, very brightest highlights I want on here. So it's very important, don't just use straight white for highlights. Especially in a case like this where I want to create sparkle in the water, I've got to be able to get the white dots to show up, and if I had a lot of white here, you wouldn't be able to see it at all. I'm going to start blocking in where some of the rocks are, and to start with, I'm just mixing black and purple together to get a really dark base. This is a filbert brush that I'm using. This is one of the Royal Soft Grip brushes. I think Michael still carries them, and I know you can get them online. They're fairly inexpensive. They're decent brushes. Not exactly sure of the point of having a soft grip because obviously I don't even hold it at that position, but the brush itself is nice, especially considering the price. And these rocks, I'll go over them with brown before I do the green. I just need something very dark to start with. Now for the mountains, for the ones in the very, very far back, I will use just light purple, and I'm not going to do any real shading on them. I'm just going to leave them that way. These mountains up front are purple and black mixed together, and I will go over these with green as well, but I just need a base of a dark color first. Make sure when you paint mountains not to just paint a bunch of triangles. That never really looks very good. You can see these ones in the back. I'm keeping very light. I've used more water in that mixture. And I'm not even really smoothing those out. I'm letting the texture from the brush work, so it just looks like little hills and valleys in those mountains in the background. I'm a big fan of any time I can let brushstrokes or let something work for me without making extra work for me, I want to take advantage of that. And so this would be one of those cases where I don't need to smooth those purple mountains out in the background. And even here on these darker ones that I'm doing, you guys will often see me go over everything that I do with a mop brush and blend things out, but it's not stuff like this. There's no reason to smooth these out. I'm going to be painting over them. I just need that dark base. So I'm going to save time and not worry about if I've got a lot of lights and darks in that base layer. So we'll speed this back up and quickly fill these in. Adding a little bit more shading in the background, but still letting my brush stroke show. But I wanted to get some more darks in those background mountains. Some of this dark color I am pulling back through into the water so that that transition between the water and the mountains is not just a harsh line. I don't want a hard line. I want to make sure that it's even. I actually took a tape measure and made sure through 3 points, middle, and then the 2 sides that I do have a straight line, but I also don't want a real harsh line there. So that's where I've got this darker transition where it just kind of fades softly from the mountains to the water. So now I'm using this little brush and coming back through, this is that round brush again, and dabbing in my base green. This is going to be the darkest of my greens. And I want to fill in or create clumps. I do not want to just randomly be putting polka dots everywhere. If you start getting a definite pattern to your trees or mountains when you're painting like this, you know something's going wrong. I'm turning the brush. I'm getting to where certain certain sections are I'm pushing harder with the brush so that I've got bigger globs, and other sections I'm much softer. I'm also dabbing this with my finger. If you work with oils, I do not recommend that because some of those can be toxic. But with this, I can use my finger just to dab and to soften all of these brush strokes that I'm doing. And this is a very dark green. I'll come back through with lighter greens later. Notice the little clumps and clusters I've created in the tree section in the background. I'm not making it even all the way through. I want these clumps. If you look through, you can see where I've got a lot of the dark sections showing through in between some of these clumps and clusters that I'm building up here. Don't try to cover everything. And I don't have a reference photo for these mountains. I'm just blocking them in. But if you're new to painting, you haven't painted mountains before, I do recommend a reference photo. You can just copy from my painting here if you want, but look at something. Make sure that you're seeing those clumps and clusters. That is a really bright green that I'm doing there. Definitely got to tone that down. Whenever I paint trees or bushes, and grass, everything, there will always be at least 3 shades of green, and usually 4 because I'll have the darkest base layer first, which is typically going to be a dark, like in this case I have the dark black and purple. Now the lighter green that I'm putting on top here, I'm not trying to cover up everything that I did. I'm just putting a few highlights here and there. Better defining some of these clusters, mostly hitting the tops of them. As I add these highlights, again, you can just so easily see the clusters that I was talking about earlier. And I don't think that's something that you're just going to know how to do. Get some reference photos. Look at how those photos, how the trees group in clusters and clumps and how you've got the shadows and the darks in between them. In most reference photos you look for nighttime scenes, you're not really going to see the trees this bright. You're not going to have many photos like this. I just use daytime photos and make everything a little bit darker to fit in with a nighttime scene. I'm using my teal color that I had from the water and starting to pull down some waterfalls coming from various sections in the mountains. Make sure whenever you're doing waterfalls that the water falling down is always falling straight down. You don't really want that at an angle. You can have where it zigzags down, but you will always have that completely vertical drop. Coming back through with an even lighter green now. Look what a difference that makes though, putting in these various shades of green, how you end up with something that started completely flat, but now it looks like there's mountains that have these hills and these valleys and different levels. Just remember, always use at least 3 different shades when you're doing something like this. I probably should start saying 4 because it generally looks a lot better. And if you're painting trees and mountains and you're having a hard time getting the bushes shaped right, or in this case, just the mountains in the background shaped right, don't be discouraged. That's something that I've seen a lot of students struggle with to begin with. That doesn't mean that you're never going to get it. It's just going to take more practice. You've got to start teaching your eye to see those hills and those clumps and clusters in the bushes and trees. Just making a little bit of fuzz for the bottom of the waterfalls. So I'm dabbing the white and then just softening it out with my finger because I don't want it to be too bright. Just want that hint of where the water's hitting the waterfall is hitting the water surface. And if you go too bright with something like this, you can always glaze more over. Just a little bit of water, or the paint with a little bit of water, make it very translucent. You just don't want to do a glaze with white, not with the normal titanium white. That's going to be too opaque and just makes things look foggy. Unless you're actually trying to create fog, you want to avoid using titanium white in your glazes. But here, if something was too white, it's not a big deal. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to glaze more teal or purple or something else over it. Making some brighter little lines in the water. I'm using a flat Taklon bristled brush here, and by holding it to the side like this brush is in very good condition. It's fairly new, so the bristles are just nice and tight and close together, so it's easy to get thin lines. This is easier to use for this technique than a liner brush would be, just because of how much paint loads into it. And as you're painting, don't feel like you need to keep your work upright at the easel all the time, how I do. You can turn it upside down, work diagonally, whatever makes it easier for you to get the brush stroke that you need. Unless you're recording videos, then you just have to get used to working upright like this. I'm coming back through with the darker turquoise underneath some of these ripples. So it's not just the water ripples from the white. I can do the same thing by coming through with the darks, which makes the whites appear that much darker or brighter. So I'm going to start blocking in the rest of my rocks. You want to make sure that you're creating balance with these. You don't just want random rocks everywhere. I've got them clustered together, and I've also got them larger on the outside edges, and then they get smaller as I work my way towards the center. I don't want a big giant rock in the middle. That won't balance out well. So those are things that you want to think about when you are figuring out where you want to put rocks and things like that. I do recommend sketching things out first, because it would be much easier on something like this. It's surreal, so you're not probably using actual reference, a finished reference photo. I'm assuming so anyway. But to find out, do a sketch to see where you want larger and smaller rocks. It'll be much easier than just painting them onto your canvas and finding out the hard way that it was too heavy in one area or another. Because while, yeah, you can paint over things, I'm never going to get my background as smooth as it is right now. If I have to cover something up in the purple in the background, you're going to be able to tell. So it would just be better if I'm a little bit more careful on something like that. With these, it's the same thing I was doing on the mountains. I don't need them perfectly smooth. I just need them blocked in and to be a dark color. And if you look at the mountain range, look at the purples that I have showing through the green, because I didn't just use flat black for my base. The purple showing through looks great. It works really, really well. And so that's what I'm doing here. While it is a much darker color being up close, I still do have purple in there. So if anything does show through, it's not just flat black. I'm going to go ahead and put some of these little floating masses down lower, although I'll partially be working off screen so you won't completely see the shape till the end. You're welcome for that. And the funny thing is, throughout the live stream, I kept telling you guys, yeah, you'll see this part in the video. No, you won't, because I forgot to turn the camera on. I mean, that happens a lot where I forget to turn the camera on, just not usually for over an hour. It's like I'm missing 5 minutes here and there generally. Good news is I was frustrated enough with myself that chances are I won't forget to do that next time. Oh, good. I did have the camera on for this. So here's where I'm coming back through with that turquoise and just dabbing in little bits around the Milky Way. I'm calling it the Milky Way. I don't know what it really is. And it just ties this in really nicely with that water. The sky was feeling so flat to me. When I would back away and look at this, just having the purples like I did, it was very, very flat. So this was definitely a needed addition to that background. And I did the same thing for the sky under the water. Pulled a little bit of that teal color into the mountains. I don't want to go too crazy with that one though. I'm really keeping that to the highlights. When I say that, I mean I'm not taking this color and throwing it into the shadowed areas. That wouldn't make any sense. So now we will move on to the live streaming section. Not a great camera angle. You can watch this, and I'll put a video in the video, a link in the video description, so you can see how this all came together live stream, and I'm explaining what I'm doing. But because it looks so bad, I'm just going to rush through this fairly quickly. And because you can still see this real time over there, but I've started with a base of brown, and I'm blocking in. I'm just creating these clusters on the rocks. And I probably don't need to do this much work on these, but I wanted you guys to see how to paint rocks in the forms, and you can see how I'm creating these clumps and clusters with them. Coming back on top with a lighter brown for some highlights. And this is just so anywhere that the moss doesn't show through or doesn't cover, you're going to see rock underneath. And this color looks really yellow. It's not. It's just the way this camera is recording. It's just a lighter brown. And I can mix an even lighter color by adding unbleached titanium white and put a few more highlights if I were leaving these just as rocks. But I'm not, so let's move on to the grass or the moss. I'm starting with this base layer of this kind of olive green. To mix this, I used red oxide or light red. I forget which one. It's a reddish brown color. I mentioned that which color it was in the live stream. But I mixed that in with my green to neutralize it so it wasn't so fluorescent. Once that dried, I came on top with an even lighter mixture of green. I just mixed more yellow and unbleached titanium white in with my previous mixture. It was all still wet. And just dabbing that on there, very much like how I did on the mountains in the background. I'm using various sized stiff brushes, rounds and flats, for this. And then one lighter color on top of that. And notice as I move on, the lighter and lighter I get, I use less and less coverage with the paint. I just want to hit the tops, just the highlights. I don't want this to cover everything. And my lightest color on this. Now for the waterfall, I've mixed my teal color again, and I am just pulling this in downward strokes, letting it trickle down in between some of the rocks, and then it comes down completely vertical once it is falling. I am using a stiff brush and just pulling this white on top. I'm basically dry brushing, which is something I normally don't like or recommend doing, but on this canvas, for this technique, it works so well. It's not really catching the tooth of the canvas because there isn't much tooth. And again, if you want to see this slow, there is the real-time version from the live stream still up, along with me answering random art questions. I'm pulling some purple, the same purple I used in the sky. I'm pulling some of that into the waterfalls because they were just too teal and white, and it was just not a good balance. So I'm just brushing some of the lighter purple into that to tone them down a bit. And here's where I remember to turn my camera back on so we can switch back to the good camera. You can see a little bit better what the rocks really look like with the lighting and the shades of green. Now I'm using a liner brush. This is a synthetic hog hair liner brush, a number 3, I believe. And I'm just adding little dots, little sparkles. And here you can really see what I meant earlier, where if I had gone with too much white, the little sparkles wouldn't have shown up. I can add little highlights on some of the waterfalls coming down. I'm also adding some horizontal lines just for the water ripples. Make sure when you're adding these little dots, the little sparkles, that you keep backing away from your painting so that you don't do too many. It's really easy to think, wow, this looks great, and to go a little overboard. The rest of this is super slow. I mean, slow moving, but it's also kind of helpful to see how much time I really take on things where I just stop and look and back away, stop and look and back away, make little teeny adjustments here and there. Decide where I want highlights, where I need to tone something down. A lot of what I'm doing right now is with the transparent mixing white so that it's not too bright. Just pulling a little bit here and there. So one thing that I did at the end, and you can see on this final image, is that I took that teal color and underlined the bottom of some of my rock masses, just to create that little bit of a lighting glow so it looks like it's being lit from the water behind it. But that is it for this one. Again, if you want to see the real-time clip of me painting the moss on the rocks, I will have a link to that live stream in the video description.